We will now recognize members for 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Rosendale, we will start with you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for convening this important hearing and for Representative Zinke introducing legislation H.R. 8952. The Crow Revenue Act is critical for ensuring the continued operation of the Bull Mountains mine, providing stability and alleviating concerns about its potential closure. Montana and its tribes rely on coal production from Bull Mountain Mine to sustain good-paying jobs and to generate essential tax revenue for government services. The ongoing efforts by this administration to restrict coal production in Montana have far-reaching consequences that extend beyond energy access for our state, the nation, and the world. In 2023, coal royalties for Montana state trust lands contributed $46 million to our public schools. Losing these funds would lead to severe shortages and force difficult decisions that can compromise high-quality education that our children receive. Moreover, this bill is essential for addressing the economic hardships facing the Crow tribe. It's not just a land swap, it's a lifeline that assures the future of the Crow tribe, supports Montana's children, and strengthens our national security. I urge my colleagues across the aisle to carefully weigh these significant implications before opposing this legislation simply because of its connection to coal. This bill is about much more than coal. It's about protecting America's interests and preserving the Western way of life in Montana. Chairman Whiteclay, thank you so much for being here today. It's great to see you again. Could you please comment on the ranking member's comments that the Crow will not share in any of these coal royalties?
Yes, those statements are completely false. The Crow tribe will benefit in the realm of, I want to say on an estimated $100 million to the Crow tribe, $10 million for 10 years. And that would significantly help with the Crow tribe, seeing as we had a 90% reduction in our revenue to the Crow tribe from the Upsalogan mine.
Thank you so much. Now, $100 million may not mean much in this city because they spend billions, but I can tell you something. In the state of Montana, $100 million is a lot. Our entire annual budget for the state is $7 billion, roughly. $7 billion for the entire state. $10 million a year for 10 years to the Crow Agency is a large amount. Chairman Clay, in your testimony, you discussed the economic challenges faced by your tribe. Could you explain the do not pay list process and its impact on your tribe's economic standing?
Yes, thank you. The Crow tribe was unjustly put on the do not pay list, which is a punitive action that was not made for tribes, and it restricts the Crow tribe from receiving any federal grants, funds, or awards from the federal government. And we were put on there for the last 4 years, and we currently are off now.
Thank you so much. Mr. Johnson's testimony describes coal as a declining industry, suggesting it's unreliable for funding essential services and infrastructure, disregarding the fact that the Biden administration and radical environmentalists are regulating coal out of business, not natural market conditions. With that perspective in mind, how does your tribe plan to use the increased funds from this legislation?
The increased funds from this legislation will go to fund everything from the Crow tribe, from social services. The MMIW is ground zero. My reservation is ground zero in the MMIW. We had 78 search and rescues this year alone for missing, murdered indigenous, and it funds everything from social programs to the elderly funds to just about everything on the Crow Reservation. We had to do that because we did not receive any federal grants or awards in my administration.
Thank you so much. Mr. Johnson, thank you for being here. Please share my greetings to Ann Hedges. I haven't seen her in quite some time, and we did a lot of work in the state legislature. You referenced the potential for a boom and bust scenario resulting from this legislation. Are you suggesting that the Crow tribe is incapable of responsibly managing its finances and preparing for future economic changes?
Representative, no. And we fully support the tribe pursuing funding. However, part of the reason that we're here today is because of what happened on the reservation recently, in which the Absaloka mine shut down. And it lost its only customer, the Sherburne Generating Station in Minnesota. And that was a significant shortfall for the tribal budget. Now, that's just indicative of a much larger issue across the United States.
Mr. Johnson, I have to reclaim my time because Ashley is gone, and now I have to yield back to the chairman. But I appreciate that you believe that the tribe should be able to manage their own affairs. And Mr. Chair, as you could see, the chairman was actually disagreeing with some of those statements, so someone may want to inquire as to what he was referring to.
I thank the gentleman from Montana. We appreciate that. And if we can come around to a second round of questions, we're glad to go ahead and reintroduce that topic. Now turn to the gentleman from California, Mr. Huffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there certainly is some good work here today that we're able to discuss in a bipartisan way. I am sorry to see, however, that we are entertaining H.R. 8952, which I do not think is a good piece of legislation. It strikes me as more of a handout to industry that would come at the expense of the American public and our natural resources. And so I wanted to dedicate my time mostly to that bill. The Signal Peak coal mine, of course, is at the heart of the proposed land swap here. The company claims that without access to federal coal in the Bull Mountain tracts, the public lands that would be traded to private landowners, that Signal Peak may be forced to close the Bull Mountain coal mine. So, Mr. Johnson, I just want to ask you, Signal Peak currently holds the federal leases for that coal. Can you please explain why the company would be willing to give up those leases for this land swap to go forward? What's in it for them?
Representative, it involves their end run around our environmental processes. Right now, there is a court order that says that the U.S. Office of Surface Mining did not do its job under its environmental analysis for the mine, and that they need to go back and redo it. And that has significant implications on the ground for people. And so rather than addressing that and evaluating it through that process, what this legislation would do is basically remove that process entirely and allow for the company to proceed without those important considerations. And some of those considerations are, what's the impact that this mine, this coal, once it's mined and burned, where it's shipped to Asia and burned, is going to have on our climate? What are the implications for people who live on the ground and ranch and have water sources that are directly impacted from the subsidence associated with this mine? I'd love to see any analysis on the land transfer issue and the fact that we're taking close to 1,000 acres of public lands and making them private in the Bull Mountains. That's a big deal in Montana, and I suspect that a lot of people would have something to say about that.
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. I want to go to Chairman Whiteclay. Welcome, sir, to the committee. It's an honor to have you here. This legislation is called the Crow Revenue Act, and I think many of us are interested in supporting our indigenous tribes, certainly in upholding sovereignty and in supporting economic development in various ways. But there's some debate about whether some of the promised revenues would actually accrue to the tribe in this case. And you laid out what sounded like a pretty clear, at least expectation of revenue sharing. Do you have a binding agreement or an instrument of some kind that you've executed with the family?
Yes, we do.
Is there any reason that can't be codified into this bill? Because right now, as we read the bill, there's nothing binding at all in the legislation.
Yeah, they're working on a technical amendment. Senate is working on a markup, but also I think that plays into action of sovereignty on the Crow tribe's part. where we as a sovereign nation can come in and we're competent as a nation to come into agreements with other entities.
But without compromising your sovereignty, if we could codify the commitment for the Hope family, that would be a way of guaranteeing that this revenue would go to you. Why not just put that in the legislation so that we can not debate this and no one needs to speculate that you're going to be left high and dry here?
Okay. Yeah, and like I said, there's a technical amendment that is coming forth in the markup on this, and we do have an agreement, binding agreement with the Hope family.
Okay, well, I hope maybe there can be some continued effort in that regard. Mr. Johnson, I want to go back to the environmental impacts. I don't have a lot of time, but the ranking member described some of the ways in which Signal Peak has not always been a good actor. And if we are simply trusting them to move forward in a thoughtful and environmentally responsible way without any environmental review, why is that a problem? And why are ranchers and local communities in the area so concerned about environmental impacts of this mine expansion?
Representative, this particular mine has lost its social license to operate. Bribery, lying to regulators, the list goes on. It's been profiled. They're currently on criminal probation, and they just can't be trusted.
All right. Thank you. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Rhode Island. I now recognize the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Zinke.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the first question goes to Mr. Johnson. And Mr. Johnson, I'm just reading your bio. Your bio states you're a policy advocate, attorney, lobbyist, and works to address the climate crisis by holding the fossil fuel industry accountable and to transition the energy system to cleaner sources. Is that correct?
Representative, it should be, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. And also, you hold a certificate from the Natural Resources Conflict Resolution from the Center of Natural Resources and Environmental Policy. You hold a certificate?
Yeah.
Do you hold a degree in any science? Any field of science?
Representative, I work with a lot
Yes,
of
yes or
different
no?
experts.
Do you hold a degree in any field in science?
No.
Okay, thank you very much.
No.
Have you done any work in treaties, particularly Indian treaties? Because you are an attorney, you're a member of the bar in good standing. Have you done any work in treaties?
I have done some work with treaties, and I'm a little bit familiar with them, but I
Are
wouldn't
you
consider
familiar with the Crow
myself an
treaties?
expert. No, I am not.
Well, actually, there's two, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to bring to the attention of the committees. There's 1851 and 1868. And the preamble is to provide for the Crow people sufficient lands to continue their way of life. The document is signed by the United States government and the Indian nation, and there is a question of sovereignty. So I'm amazed during the hearing here that the efficacy, the integrity of Signal Peak somehow is relevant to this discussion. I contend it is not. They are a sovereign nation. If they want to make a deal with Disneyland, they have that right as a sovereign nation. Mr. Chairman, I'd ask you, do you also hold the same opinion?
Yes, I do. Thank you.
Mr. Johnson, have you ever taken a tour of Bull Mountain?
Representative, I've never been invited.
Because in your testimony, you said the elk were sensitive to Bull Mountain. I know you don't have a degree in science, but how would that be since Bull Mountain is an underground mine about 800 feet below the surface?
Representative, I'd encourage you to just take a look at my testimony. It wasn't that the elk are sensitive to the underground mine. It was that people enjoy hunting elk in Montana, in particular on our public lands, and this particular legislation would take public lands close to 1,000 acres that people do hunt elk on. I know people that go up there and do it, and privatize them. And that's the major concern associated with this legislation, is the privatization of the public lands in the Bull Mountains. In terms of the Crow sovereignty...
Let me ask you this. The privatization, they're most from mineral rights, right? Subsurface mineral rights. Is that true, Mr. Chairman? Can I ask you that?
Yes.
So subsurface mineral rights at 800 feet. how does that affect surface hunting and fishing, just out of curiosity? And Mr. Chairman, I'd like you to answer that. Does it affect surface hunting, fishing, and on the reservation, sir?
No, it does not.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Montana. We will now go to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kamlager-Dove.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the witnesses for being here today. Now, I fully respect the Crow tribe's need for new sources of revenue and firmly believe we can and should do more to help communities across the country, especially tribal communities, that are losing revenue from the decline of certain resources like coal. However, I'm concerned that this bill, as written, does not deliver on its sponsors' promises. We have heard that the Crow tribe will share in revenue from the Bull Mountain tracts, that is from Signal Peak's mine, once the land swap goes through. However, as written, the bill instead calls for the Hope family, the private landowners who would relinquish their mineral rights to the tribe, to share in revenues from any future development of the tribally owned coal. We have heard that a technical fix is a-comin'. So the Crow tribe will indeed share in revenues from the Bull Mountain mine when the technical fix comes. Even if that happens, I actually remain skeptical that this bill will generate revenue for the tribe. And while I respect Chairman Whiteclay's negotiations for the tribe, we are talking about trading public lands and revenues, and I would be more comfortable with legislative guarantees. So, Mr. Johnson, does this bill as written guarantee revenue sharing, and if so, how?
Representative, it does not. And I want to be clear here. The land exchange that's currently occurring on the Crow tribe is a wonderful thing, and they should take possession of those lands. The problem is the public lands that would be given away in the Bull Mountains, close to 1,000 acres, both mineral and surface, about 4,000 mineral acres and 1,000 surface acres of lands in the Bull Mountains. Now, the way that the revenue sharing agreement is currently written, it states that the Crow tribe would share in revenue from the Hope family tracts. Those are the coal resources that are located on the Crow Reservation. How it should probably read is that they would share in the Signal Peak tracts, the revenue sharing agreement, and that would allow for potentially some revenue to go to the tribe. However, as we've already sort of heard
But
today—
you said potentially, so that's not guaranteed.
That's correct, Representative, and that's because, as written, the revenue sharing agreement is not a condition of the lands transfer. There's no requirement that the negotiations occur in good faith. There's no requirement that revenue actually be part of this legislation. And that's one of our major concerns here, is we don't actually know whether this is going to occur. There's no agreement that's been made public that the American public can see to determine whether or not this is actually a good deal. And the impacts are really enormous in terms of this mine. Water quality impacts, transfer of public lands. And so in the sum of all those things, and without that revenue sharing agreement information, we're opposed to this legislation.
So, Mr. Johnson, what I heard you say, and please correct me if I've misheard, there's no requirement of revenue sharing, there's no guarantee of revenue sharing, and there's also no transparency that revenue sharing would happen and how it would happen. No transparency for both either the Crow tribe or for the public. Is that correct?
Representative, that's correct. The legislation will pass, and if at some point in time in the future a revenue sharing agreement is entered into, the only requirement in this bill is that it be sent to the secretary to basically be filed away. Mm-hmm. That's not confirmation that this is actually a revenue sharing agreement. That's not transparency for the American public. We're talking about giving away public mineral resources and public lands. What's the deal, and is it worth it? That's the answer that needs to be opened up so that the public can see.
Yeah, so you said, is it worth it? So can you expand on some of the local impacts of the mine to the environment so we have a better sense of if it is worth it?
Representative, in Montana, cattle ranching is a big deal, and in order to do that, you need access to water. Water is incredibly critical, and this mine, through its processes, has devastated the water supply in the Bull Mountains because of the undermining that occurs. It basically fractures and subsides the lands and dewaters the springs and the wells that ranchers have depended upon for generations to run their operations. And if this mine proceeds with this agreement, that's what we're going to have more of. It's going to be exacerbated. In addition to the climate issues, in addition to the public land transfer issues, this legislation is just a step too far.
Thank you for that, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman from California. We now go to the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Graves.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate all of you being here today for the hearing. I'm sure many of you have seen the stores have jumped straight from Thanksgiving into Christmas, and so apparently we're already in Christmas season here, and it reminds me that here we are at Christmas season, and this is the only year. This is the first year, the only year. Hey, Santa Claus is real, just want to be clear. The only year that we have not had a lease sale for offshore energy, okay? This is the only year since offshore energy lease sales have taken place, we have not had one. So what it does is it creates uncertainty in the energy sector for what the future of energy production is going to be. It creates uncertainty. You have issues where when you create uncertainty, it creates lack of investment. But global demand for energy doesn't decrease just because supply is decreasing. What happens is it gets filled by different places. And so, for example, there were studies that were done that found that Russia this year alone is projected to profit an additional $112 billion. Let me say that number again. Russia will profit an additional $112 billion by filling the global void with their energy. It is predicted or projected that Iran last year alone profited an additional $53 billion, that Venezuela last month increased their exports of energy by 65%. Mr. Johnson, I know that in your testimony you cite ESG and you cite how European countries are using environmental and social governance criteria to look at how they're getting their energy sources, and I think sort of suggesting the United States needs to put more scrutiny. But where I struggle is that right now the European Union is importing somewhere, if I recall, between 15 and 20% of their gas from Russia. According to the National Energy Technology Labs, the United States natural gas, LNG, exported to Europe has a 42% lower emissions profile over its life. So I guess I'm struggling when you're telling us to act like Europe, whenever Europe is acting like idiots. And let me just put a face on it. If we had taken 1 year of Russian gas supplies to the European Union, 1 year, the year the Ukrainian war started, we would have reduced global emissions. Ready for the number? 218 million tons. So help me understand how that makes sense.
Representative, I think that the main thing that we need to be thinking about here is the opportunity that we have with ESG, and in making sure that our supply chains are actually something that can work for the American people and for American manufacturing.
Fantastic. So let me go ahead and stop you right there. Thank you, and because you're making my next point. So we're talking about supply chains. Great. Look at that. I just found this poster sitting right here. Look at that. So Mr. Johnson, this shows the critical minerals and where we're bringing them in from. We have an administration that's energy strategy, and I've said this over and over again, their energy strategy is incompatible with their regulatory agenda. It's incompatible with their critical mineral strategy. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to include in the record, because Mr. Johnson's citing the importance of making sure that we have a supply chain that makes sense, and I'd like to think that U.S. objectives in terms of making sense when you think about ESG, if that's where we need to be going. This is a 2024 report by the United States Department of Labor that was prepared, obviously under the Biden administration, that cites the list of goods produced by child and forced labor around the globe. Pretty extensive. And what this does is it goes through and it shows that what we're doing is we're trading energy that could be produced domestically, creating jobs, higher environmental standards, appropriate labor standards, and I don't know, activity in the United States, economic activity in the United States, and we're trading it for labor that is forced in child labor in other countries that has lower environmental standards. Do we care about global environmental standards, or are we just going to sit here and put a blind eye and just bring in energy from other countries when they go and trash the environment? It doesn't make any sense from a global perspective. And I remind you, this year, highest emissions ever. And much of that is a result of the incredibly reckless, irresponsible, and inexperienced energy strategy out of this administration. Out of this administration. It really is embarrassing to see folks sit here and come and advocate for things that result in more economic activity in other countries, a greater trade deficit, worse environmental outcomes, and increasing energy unaffordability in the United States. Yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Louisiana. Do you think today as we speak, when we look at the overall extraction and refinement of critical minerals and rare earth elements, where we see around the world that China has 70% of the extraction capability worldwide and 90% of the refining capability, and the United States is overly reliant on China to not only purchase minerals, but by the way, as we heard from Mr. Collins, and now what we hear also in recycling those materials, where we create a substance called black mass, where we take out the other components except the metals, and we say we're going to recycle that, and where do we send the black mass? We send it to China, so China can refine it and do what? Sell it back to us. Would you say, with the comparisons that we've just made with adherence to the rule of law, with the protection of human rights, with the protection of the environment, that the United States, if it continues to buy and rely on China for critical minerals and rare earth elements, seems like to me that we're supporting a country that doesn't adhere to the rule of law. We're supporting a country that doesn't abide by human rights. We're supporting the destruction of the environment. Would I be correct in reaching that assumption with your affirmative answers to those series of questions? I'll go to Mr. Johnson and to Chairman Whiteclay if you'd like to reflect on the series of questions there and your perspective on that.
Thank you for the question, Representative. I think it's important, and I do agree that we probably do have some better environmental practices here in the United States, but in my experience on the ground in Montana, we got a long ways to go still. And I don't think that we should necessarily excuse some of the issues that we see across the world to do an okay job here. I can point to places in Montana just out my backyard where there's mines that are $20 million under bonded, so the Montana taxpayers are going to have to pick the bill up, and where a critical trout stream is about ready to turn into a waterfall right into that particular mine. These are on-the-ground impacts that shouldn't be happening, that we can fix, and we can do it in a way that causes for leadership in the United States to demonstrate that not only can we do it right, but we can do it in a way that's competitive across the world.
And the wherewithal is we have the will and the ability to do it versus China, which has no interest in doing it. So I would agree with your observation there. Chairman Whiteclay?
Yes, I agree with you, Chairman, on that the United States is and is a better choice for critical minerals. But as a casualty of the war on coal, I'm a former coal miner, and I have brothers and sisters in the union that mine palladium in Montana that 300 and close to 300 and something jobs are right now in jeopardy, and another 400 jobs were lost this past year in the palladium mine there. So as a coal miner and as a miner, we see the effects on heavy regulations, and my whole tribe is a casualty of the war on coal also. So I'm for better standards, but also at what cost?
Very good. I'd like to thank our witnesses. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today, for answering our questions, giving us your perspective on things. Very, very helpful as this committee considers the bills on the docket today. We thank you.